Good morning and welcome. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Devorah Margolin and I'm a senior research fellow here at the program on extremism. And welcome to today's event titled From Online Extremism to Offline Violence, Section 230 and Content Moderation. For those of you who are just joining this discussion, Section 230 refers to the Communications Decency Act of 1996, where Section 230, specifically 230C1, generally provides immunity for websites publishers of third-party content. Terrorist attacks in Pittsburgh and Christchurch have increasingly underscored the links between online extremism and offline violence. In the aftermath of these incidents, we've seen countries like the UK, Australia, and France respond more robustly to regulatory measures to target online extremism. Here in the US, our discussion focuses on Section 230, which has become one of the most important and controversial aspects of content moderation online. Almost 25 years old now, Section 230 has an outsized impact on efforts to counter terrorist use of the internet, and recent proposals by the Department of Justice highlight the ongoing debate and need for the reform of the statute. At today's event, we are joined by three impressive speakers who will tackle the different aspects of Section 230 and content moderation related to extremism online and offline consequences. First, we'll be hearing from Mary McCord. Mary is legal director at the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, ICAP, and a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center. At ICAP, Mary leads a team that brings constitutional impact litigation to all levels of federal and state courts across a wide variety of areas, including First Amendment rights, immigration, criminal justice reform, and combating the rise of private paramilitaries. McCord was the acting assistant attorney general for national security at the Department of Justice from 2016 to 2017, and principal deputy assistant attorney general for the National Security Division from 2014 to 2016. Previously, McCord was an assistant U.S. attorney for nearly 20 years. We're also joined today by Alexander Guittard, a fellow at the Program on Extremism and director at MNC Saatchi, where he leads the U.S. National Security Partner for the organization, one of the world's leading advertising and communications agencies. He has over 10 years of experience in counterterrorism in the U.S. government, including counterterrorism policy lead at U.S. Embassy London as a Foreign Service officer. And finally, we are joined by former POE research fellow and researcher and instructor at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, Audrey Alexander. Mary, we'll begin with you.
Sure, thanks to GW's Program on Extremism for putting this together. It's particularly timely, I think, as we come into elections in the US, as we see increased polarization in the US, and as we see the internet being used actually by people to call for a civil war. There are actually, posts up right now that are being sent to me on a day-to-day basis, and that is the title, Civil War 2.0. So I think it's particularly timely to talk about terrorist use of the internet and also just extremist use of the internet more generally. In my work in the government, of course, I focused on terrorism in my last few years at the National Security Division, and those were the years during which ISIS declared a caliphate in the spring of 2014. We had a series of heinous actions taken through that summer, including the beheadings of Americans as well as other citizens of other countries. We saw a rise throughout 2014 and 2015 of foreign terrorist fighters traveling from the US, Western Europe, Southeast Asia, Australia, and elsewhere to join ISIS in its building of the caliphate. And we had all of this being done through use of social media and the internet. And this was very different from what we had certainly seen with Al-Qaeda, which relied more on in-person gatherings, in-person communications, direct communications. Partly that was just the time. The Al-Qaeda, predates some of the ubiquity of social media, but partly it was also the very much part of the built-in tactics of ISIS to use social media to recruit, to propagate its message, and to plan. And social media played a big part of that. It took a while, longer than it should have, to get our major platforms like Facebook and Twitter, Google, YouTube, to become more aggressive in taking down content that allowed the organizing and recruitment and funding of foreign terrorist organizations like ISIS. Eventually, they did come around and get more aggressive about taking down content, but still there are gaps. Fast forward a couple of years, we're seeing a rise here at home in domestic extremist use of the internet that, to my mind, is a movie I've seen before. This is exactly the techniques that ISIS used, and it's been used by extremist organizations in the US, primarily white supremacist organizations, and also far right-wing paramilitary organizations. We're talking about groups who sometimes call themselves militias, sometimes call themselves civil guard units, sometimes call themselves patriots. But what they are doing is not authorized by federal or state law. It's not protected by the Second Amendment. And in fact, it's barred by all 50 states. And that is this organized, armed use of force or projection of the ability to use force without, totally outside of governmental accountability. So we're talking about groups doing things like storming the State House in Michigan or in Ohio or in Idaho at the beginning of the pandemic in opposition to state government public health safety measures such as stay-at-home orders, masking orders, etc. We're also talking about these groups self-activating or deploying ostensibly to augment legitimate law enforcement by purporting to protect property, protect statues, even protect protesters against what are oftentimes just false rumors, again, propagated over social media, of violent anarchists coming to town when the reality is maybe it's a high school group planning a racial justice demonstration in the downtown. These groups come heavily armed, they intimidate First Amendment freedoms and speech, and they heighten tensions and aggressiveness. And we've seen some of the tragic results with the shootings in Kenosha, Wisconsin, resulting in the deaths of 2 people and the serious injury of another, and with similar shootings in Albuquerque, Portland, and elsewhere. All of these groups that we've been talking about do the vast majority of their organizing online. Now, we've recently seen that Facebook has made a policy decision to take down pages not only of QAnon, another conspiracy theory extremist group we can certainly talk about, but also of militia organizations. We've seen Twitter start to take some similar measures, but it's still a little too little and a little too late because I'm glad to see it. It's a good development, but why has it taken so long? I feel like it took too long to do it in the face of foreign terrorist organizations. It's taking too long to take those aggressive measures when we're talking about domestic extremism. And so when we talk about things like reform of Section 230C, we also have to talk about, well, what does that mean? What kind of liability would be appropriate for social media companies? And I will first remind people that already the Communications Decency Act does not protect against criminal liability. But criminal liability under US law requires specific intent. So it would require proof of a social media company or internet platform to actually have intended to further the terrorist attack or further a material support to terrorism in order to be liable under the criminal statutes. That could be very, very difficult when we're talking about massive communications, massive numbers of posts, et cetera, across a social media platform. So some of the reforms being proposed would not necessarily change the criminal liability, but at least allow for more civil liability, particularly when a platform has notice of the offending content. And this is content that can very well lead to bodily harm, physical injury, and certainly property damage. I mean, let's just think of what happened 2 weeks ago with the plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer, the governor of Michigan. Originally, some of these communications, the way that these groups were able to mobilize across state lines was over social media. Now, ultimately, they came together physically. They had physical meetings, physical trainings, deployed their own operational security of stripping everyone of their cell phones and meeting in the basement under a trap door in order to have operational security. But the original ability to organize these like-minded people and bring them together for this heinous terrorist plot was done on social media, like so many other similar types of plots. So I think it's a very timely topic. I also, think it's a time to talk again about some of the gaps in our terrorism statutes in the US Code. These are things I have written and spoken about in the past, because although we have many, many terrorist crimes, they really do focus on international terrorism. And we've seen through Director Chris Wray's testimony of Department of Homeland Security officials, and just facts on the ground, great research from organizations like GW's Program on Extremism, and other organizations like Audrey's team up at West Point, and like the work of the ADL and the SPLC. We know that the greatest terrorism threat in the US right now comes from racially motivated terrorism, and specifically white supremacist motivated terrorism. So the gaps that exist in our laws right now include a gap when it comes to mass shootings, or using your car or a vehicle to do a vehicle ramming, which is becoming astonishingly more popular in just the last 7 or 8 months here in the US as a means of intimidating and coercing people. Right now, if either type of crime is committed, a mass shooting or a vehicle ramming by someone who is doing it in furtherance of a white supremacist ideology or other ideology that is not connected to a foreign terrorist organization, there is no terrorism crime that applies to it. There will be other crimes. There will be state law crimes. There might be hate crimes depending on who the target is, but there won't be a crime that has the label terrorism on it. And it's time we filled that gap to create a moral equivalency between our international terrorism and our domestic terrorism, to create more consistency in our approach as law enforcement officials, not that any of us currently are anymore, but for law enforcement officials and for the National Counterterrorism Program. Because of course, white supremacy also doesn't end at the borders. There's a similar connectivity internationally when it comes to white supremacist motivated terrorism and other types of ideological terrorism, similar to what we've seen with Islamist extremist terrorism. So I'm happy and looking forward to talking about some of those gaps, how we might fill those gaps, and the impact of filling those gaps on potential liability for under a potentially revised version of Section 230. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mary. Before handing over to Alex, I just want to remind everyone there's a Q&A function. Please feel free to use it. Begin to ask questions as they come to mind. After the panelists speak, I will go and pull a few of those out there for our discussion. Alex, over to you.
Thanks, Devin, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor to be on this panel, so thank you very much. As Dev mentioned, my background is somebody who started working on counterterrorism in governments and then moved to the private sector. So I'll use that to inform my remarks today. There's two things. There's two things to keep in mind. The first is that we've been here before, both, as Mary said, very recently with regard to terrorist use of the internet, but more broadly with the intersection of new technology and democratic life in America. It's something that's happened several times in the last century. The second is that this is not exclusively a counterterrorism problem. If it ever was, it certainly isn't anymore. It's a much broader problem that relates to speech, technology, and democracy. So those are two things to keep in mind. So the first, how we've been here before. In the last century, there are 3 examples that I wrote my recent paper on: the use of radio, financial services, and air travel, where new technology emerged. It was enjoyed by 99% of the people in the country peacefully, and it was abused by terrorists or international criminals. In those cases, the new technology pushed up against the regulatory frontier. There was a period of tension. Industry didn't want it, obviously. The government did. And after some tension, it usually resulted in a new regulatory framework. In the First World War, before the First World War, there were very little licensing requirements for radio. It perhaps looked the way that the internet maybe did in the 1990s, like a wild west of internet. People had radio stations in their houses. It was very unregulated. When World War I happened, the prospect or when the U.S. entered World War I, the prospect of German saboteurs communicating secretly with Berlin in the east coast of the United States led Congress to authorize the president to seize all private radios, all private radio stations. So all amateur and private radio stations were either taken by the government or forced to shut down. This laid the foundation for the principle that we have for our TV and radio regulation, where the airwaves are public property, owned and distributed by the government. Now, this is not desirous or practical for social media, but it's an important sort of distinction in how we talk about framing media regulation. From the onset, national security and public interest have been at the center of broadcast media in a way that they aren't in digital and social media. And we shouldn't walk backwards, but we should probably try and find a way to return public interest to the center of our regulatory approach. The second case was in the 1970s when Congress imposed the Bank Security Act, which required banks, as they do today, to proactively monitor their channels for illicit transactions. Anyone who's ever worked at a bank or knows someone who works for a bank knows that every employee from the top to the bottom is trained in money laundering and counter finance detection, and everyone has a responsibility to speak up if they see something. Perhaps this is, in some of the best tech companies today, this is also at play. But the distinction was that it created a penalty that removed any incentive to potentially turn the other way when something illicit occurs within your financial system. Now, unsurprisingly, banks did not want this. They took it to the Supreme Court, and banks argued, much as today's internet media companies would, that they were neutral platforms. They're places where you can come and make deposits or exchange certificates or wire money. And what happens here, if illegal activity is happening here, that's a law enforcement problem. The government should come in and monitor and do that. The Supreme Court led, in a decision written by the conservative Justice Rehnquist, found that these banks were not neutral arbiters of their customers, and that they could and should ensure that their instruments are not misused to aid terrorism or crime. Similarly, air travel. These seem very antiquated, by the way, very analog examples of technological development, but they were transformative when they came about. The idea that you could get on a plane and go somewhere in a few hours was completely revolutionary at the time. And it was revolutionary for terrorists of all ideological stripes who misuse this technological breakthrough to advance a range of ideological sort of views. At the time, airlines did not want to screen passengers. They thought it was not, they didn't think they had the constitutional authority to do it, and they didn't want to hurt their bottom line by suggesting that air travel was unsafe, that anyone would ever misuse air travel. It wasn't until a hijacked airline almost crashed into a nuclear power plant that the government was able to finally impose some kind of air travel passenger screening. Now that system failed pretty colossally in 2001, and it was nationalized. Passenger screening is we now understand it to be a national security activity that we appropriate money for, and that airlines and customers pay an additional fee on their tickets to support. So these examples I think are important to illustrate that while there are deep constitutional questions today in setting limits around speech, there were also questions then around privacy, around search and seizure, and around speech, and we navigated them. And something is now probably in a way that is more robust than the current version of Section 230 allows. And the final point is that, as Mary said, and as Brian Fisher wrote a paper last year, he's a terrorism sort of leader at Facebook, a counterterrorism leader at Facebook, wrote that terrorists use the internet much like all of us. They misuse it like us too. And so if we're drawing lines around types of speech, and we talk about propaganda, or if we're just keeping terror speech, it's a question of political speech. And we have to be very careful to not impose a regulatory framework that seeks to advance, to promote security, and that ignores these deeper political questions about the way tech and democracy interact.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alex. And last but definitely not least, I'm going to hand over to Audrey Alexander.
Great. So thanks so much for having me. I'm tasked with squeezing 5 to 7 hours of thoughts into 5 to 7 minutes. So we're going to dive right in. I guess just to set the tone, or the mantra for today's message is don't get mad, get moving, because I think our field has a tendency to ruminate over everything that's been done wrong. And so for today, especially, I want to take that energy and throw it towards problem solving and starting to think about what we can actually do in this space instead of everything that hasn't necessarily been done right. And I think especially following on Alex's points about the history of this, and this is a cycle. We basically need to get in on the cycle and understand that we need to be part of that process. So today, the US government, like many of its allies, is reckoning with the complexity and endurance of the challenges posed by terrorists and violent extremists' abuse of information communications technologies. And like it or not, especially as breaking news this morning revealed with the Iran spoofing emails using under the banner of the Proud Boys, there's also a nexus between non-state actors and violent extremist communications. This problem set isn't going to get easier, it's only going to get harder, which is part of why we need to start charging forward and instead of focusing on everything we've done wrong. So ultimately, although policymakers and practitioners recognize that there is a problem, existing efforts to address exploitation of information and communications technologies often consist of a cursory response to long-term and dynamic threats. But as US allies draft and implement policies designed to tackle terrorist and violent extremist materials online, including the Christchurch call, which the US abstained from, demands for the US government to prevent and counter the abuse of information and communications technology persists. Since some of the measures advanced by other countries are not necessarily suitable or viable models for US policymakers, the government must devise its own unique and complementary approaches that rest on the pillars of pragmatism, proportionality, and certainly respect for the rule of law. So in a policy paper that I published with the Program on Extremism a year ago, I argued that the government should craft a comprehensive strategy to prevent and counter the exploitation of information and communications technology. Now, I know this is ideal, but that's okay, because I think that even in articulating this idealism, we can identify some steps that are really viable and possible to implement. Even if the big picture is sort of rose-colored glasses, there might be components of this that we really can act upon, which is why it's worth working through. So the objective here is really to marginalize the threat and manage it. Stamping it out altogether is a costly and unrealistic approach, at least in my view. So here are some steps I believe could help pave the way forward. So first, the US could consider creating an interagency body to formalize leadership on domestic efforts. And this entity can plan and coordinate efforts to prevent and counter terrorist and violent extremist exploitation of information and communications technology. So again, just sort of identifying a body that acts as a lead on this is really critical to a strategic and intentional approach. Next, this body or any actor within the US government really could conduct a comprehensive assessment of terrorist and violent extremist exploitation of these tools and identify short, medium, and long-term responses to the problem and take time to evaluate those. Once completed, I think that a working group or designated body should use this assessment to inform the implementation of policy development. So whether this is discussing intermediary liability in Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, other things we could look at are reviving the Office of Technology Assessment, looking at whether issuing best practices to relevant stakeholders is a useful mechanism for the government to use to try and intervene in this space. These are just some of the examples that I wanted to point to. So next, I think that the US government can work to enhance the capability and coordination of government-led efforts to prevent and counter terrorist and extremist exploitation of information and communications technology. For the sake of time, I'm just going to move on to the next point, which is we need to look at ways to pursue partnerships with and empower non-governmental entities that can complement the government's initiatives to prevent and counter terrorist and violent extremist exploitation in both pragmatic and proportional ways. So one of the things that we heard often in the countering violent extremism discussion is we don't need to reinvent the wheel, and just gonna adopt that, even though I think we all sort of started to roll our eyes at a certain point. But the point is, we don't actually need to start from scratch with this. There have been quite a few evaluated or programs that have been deemed successful that are using internet safety campaigns to try and educate the public, such as On Guard Online, Stop Think Connect, and Safe Online Surfing. So if we can sort of fold part of this problem set into those campaigns and into those existing initiatives that have infrastructure, that may be a productive way to get a lot more information about this problem to a broader part of the community. So the last sort of recommendation, and these are broad recommendations, but I have subset recommendations I'm happy to discuss, is that we need to facilitate productive engagements with technology providers to more effectively prevent and counter terrorist and violent extremist exploitation of information and communication technologies, again, in pragmatic and proportional ways. The name and shame approach has only gotten us so far. If you look at the US, historically, we've been asking, at least since 2006 is one of the first times I recognize it, YouTube to take down certain videos online. And that's not to say that everything hasn't led to changes in policy, but ultimately, I think that we need to look at the ecosystem writ large, and our focus and engagement needs to engage more players in the community because of the ecosystem that terrorists and violent extremists leverage to push out their communications technology, and especially thinking about the size and capabilities of the companies that we're trying to engage. And again, that's where the pragmatism component really comes in. So in sum, I believe that political leaders in the US should use legislation, redress, and strategic outreach to unite a range of actors against the exploitation of information and communications technologies. And in doing so, this will allow us to do a better job of confronting the ecosystem of communications writ large. And I think that progressively over time, we're going to be doing a better job of identifying threats early on and marginalizing these threats before they grow. But this is going to take time and patience and resilience on our part. So I don't want to end being dangerously optimistic, but I'm going to dare to do so by saying I believe we can do a lot of good in this area by recognizing the resilience and agility of these actors and matching them and coming together instead of falling apart in the face of these challenges and working to find solutions that will allow us to adapt with this cycle in the years to come. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much to our speakers. Audrey, since you just kind of wrapped up and you're still going, I wanted to ask you about comparing the Islamic State and right-wing extremism here in the United States. When we look at the different challenges between these two ideologies, the threat isn't monolithic or cohesive. How does that manifest here in the US?
Yeah, so I think it matters in the US, but also in terms of how we work with our allies and partners. So the global coalition against ISIS is really an unprecedented reckoning and getting everyone to come together to fight this threat. And ultimately, we have a lot of consensus around the Islamic State, and we still have a really difficult time of dealing with those threats online. So I think at the end of the day, we have to recognize that even if we are able to find consensus and push these laws forward and get on a better page about recognizing these threats, that's still our starting place. Because we still have a lot of questions about implementation and dedicating resources, because when we start getting to these areas where we have a lot less consensus, if we're going into a complicated problem with a lot less consensus, that's going to set us off on a really unequal footing. So we have to recognize too that our offline laws and policies certainly affect the online space, and our priorities and what we emphasize in the real world are things that we end up targeting in the virtual.
Excellent, thank you.
Something in response to that question as well, because I think one thing, and this spins off some of the things that Audrey was saying earlier, but I think one of the distinctions, frankly, between an ISIS use of the internet and right-wing, far right-wing extremist use of the internet is One is just much more normalized than the others. So in America, since 9/11 and even before, but certainly since 9/11, people associate the term terrorist with Islamist extremists. First Al-Qaeda, now ISIS. Most people probably don't even realize the other organizations that are on the foreign terrorist organization designated list. But when we are talking, but there is a continuum, a path of radicalization to violence, that whether it's Islamist extremism or far-right extremism, white supremacist extremism, sometimes starts in a place that seems far less radical than where it could potentially end. And I would say that is particularly so when we talk about white supremacist extremism and far-right extremism, because already for so many Americans, the Islamist extremism is already so foreign to them, or they've already put that in a bucket, rightly or wrongly, based on 9/11. But when it comes to right-wing ideologies, some of these seem a lot more normal, a lot more like what their neighbor believes in. We're talking about absolutist views of the Second Amendment that, by the way, are not supported by text, history, or Supreme Court precedent, but nevertheless, they're harbored by many, many people in the US. We're talking about anti-immigrant views that might be not stated as anti-immigrant, but stated more as pro-American, right? So there's all kinds of ways that groups normalize extremism that seem more approachable and friendly, for lack of a better word, to Americans who might not even know when they start to get on board that train, that train is chugging toward far more extremist views and potentially even violence. So as we approach that, that has implications, obviously, for how do we counter it, how do we regulate it, if at all, you know, and really just all of our, as Audrey said, our offline approaches as well as our online approaches. But I think it's important to recognize we don't start from the point of terrorist communications over the internet, like, hey, let's go bomb a military base or let's go kidnap a governor, right? They start at a very different place. They get sucked in. There's a lot of talk about patriotism right now, and it's actually also coming from the president. And these are dog whistles to these groups that to cloak themselves in the flag as though they are patriots, but really the bottom line of their beliefs are quite extreme.
Excellent, and thank you. Alex, this one I'm going to toss to you. Do you think that Facebook's oversight board is a positive development? What more can social media companies be doing short of government regulation in order to stem the incitement of violence while protecting freedom of speech? And this is from Roger Phillips.
So absolutely. I mean, anything that these companies are doing to be more responsible is welcome, and we should be encouraging. I mean, when we were all in government, this was the sort of thing that we were sort of inducing these companies to do on their own. The question for me is, you know, is counterterrorism, and this was the title of my paper, is counterterrorism a public or a private function? I mean, protecting the country against terrorists is a job for the government, and you know, setting the rules should be something we do through our legislative bodies. It's, to me, it seems I'm uneasy ceding leadership in this space to private companies, not because they're bad, but because they have different motives and different interests. If a company, you know, might go public or is looking to be acquired, it will approach content moderation in a different way. I think a much more healthy approach, and this is what happens in Europe, which has its own set of challenges, you know, by the way, is to set some high-level broad rules. For example, in Germany, it's illegal to deny the Holocaust. So Facebook follows that rule and polices its platforms to remove any Holocaust denial. For a long time, we heard from platforms that it wasn't possible to do this. It wasn't possible to regulate their you know, all the content. We've since seen that it is possible. I mean, with the response to COVID-19, the sort of actions against militias or pseudo militias like the Proud Boys and other far right groups that they're doing now. I think the most important thing is to encourage this positive action, but it doesn't absolve them of needing to comply with a regulatory framework that the people vote on and decide.
Excellent, thank you. You actually answered two of our questions from our audience, because someone else asked, is there an example of policies by other national governments that the speakers could highlight for good practice? So thank you. Mary, this one's for you. Could you speak about how domestic terrorism statute could encourage or incentivize tech companies to be more robustly counter-terrorist and extremist exploitation of the internet?
Sure. Well, as I indicated in my opening comments, right now there is no terrorism statute applies to the most common form of terrorism in the US, which are mass shootings. And so right now, just to put a concreteness to that, if the El Paso shooter had pledged bayat to al-Baghdadi and to ISIS before he committed his crimes, he would be charged with multiple terrorist crimes. He would be doing that, attempting to do that on behalf of a designated foreign terrorist organization. He would be providing material support to a terrorist organization. And so he would be, labeled a terrorist and charged with terrorist crimes. But because he did his mass shooting in order to create a white ethno-state, in order to repel what he perceived to be the Latino invasion across the southern border, there is no terrorism crime that applies to that. So one of the things that I have talked about is trying to create a new offense that would apply to all acts of terrorism occurring in the territorial US, regardless of ideology. So it would apply whether it's motivated by Islamist extremism, white supremacist extremism, animal rights extremism, anarchist extremism, whatever, doesn't matter the ideology. If it's a crime of violence and it's done to intimidate or coerce the civilian population or influence a policy of government through intimidation or coercion, then that would just be terrorism in the territorial United States, right? And so that would fill this gap I've just been talking about, because it would apply to mass shootings. Those are crimes of violence. It would apply to vehicle rammings. Those are crimes of violence. It would make them federal crimes. It would make them terrorist crimes. That also means that when somebody is accumulating or stockpiling weapons to use in a domestic terrorist attack, you would have terrorist laws that would apply to that, because the counterterrorism program in the US, as implemented through its criminal statutes, really is about preventions. It's less about let's be able to punish the El Paso shooter as a terrorist after the fact. It's about how can we deploy our investigative resources to thwart and prevent terrorist attacks. And that's really why we have statutes like material support statutes, but they don't apply right now when we're talking about a lot of the most typical types of domestic terrorism. So for example, if we had this crime of terrorism in the territorial US, as I just mentioned, if people were stockpiling weapons, let's say assault rifles, for use in a mass shooting in order to further their goals of creating an ethno-state. And we've seen this happen. We saw it with Christopher Paul Hassan, a US Coast Guard official who was stockpiling assault rifles, stockpiling other equipment in order to commit a series of mass shootings to further a white ethno-state. If you had this crime of domestic terrorism or just terrorism in the territorial US, as I've been talking about, then his stockpiling of those weapons would violate 18 U.S.C. 2339 capital A. That is the crime of providing material support or resources to a terrorist act, not to a foreign terrorist organization, because we don't designate domestic organizations as terrorist organizations. Domestic organizations have First Amendment rights, but to a terrorist act. And so you could show that he was stockpiling those weapons, concealing the nature of those weapons, knowing and intending that they would be used in a terrorist attack, that terrorist attack being this new crime of terrorism in the territorial US. Right now, we don't have that. So Christopher Paul Hassan was charged with unlawful possession of a silencer. He was charged with unlawful possession of drugs because he had drugs in his house when the search warrant was executed, and unlawful possession of a firearm by a drug addict because he had drugs in the house when the search warrant was executed. None of these are called terrorism. They're all pretty minor offenses in terms of the sentencing exposure, but that's all that the government had to use. So how does that impact technology and social media? Again, if we're talking about knowledge, now here, in the case of Christopher Paul Hassan, I can't say that he was planning anything over social media. I can say he was probably radicalized over social media, because every case I saw in my tenure in National Security Division, there was radicalization that had taken place over social media. It was oftentimes the way the government was actually able to prove intent. But in the case of Christopher Paul Hassan, we certainly had plenty of his own his own writings, his own manifesto, et cetera, that established his intent, and we had his searches online for targets. I can't say we had communications, because typically that's how the government will establish intent in a lot of its counterterrorism cases, because there are various communications online and social media communications that help to establish that intent. But it provides another area for social media companies, technology companies to say, okay, here's this crime. We don't want our platforms to be used in commission of that crime. And so it's another place for them to focus efforts, because they are oftentimes reluctant to do what they're completely permitted to do, which is take down content that violates their own terms of service. They will sometimes hide behind the First Amendment and say, well, we don't want to take down too much content because of First Amendment rights. But they are private companies. They can take down anything they want, so long as they don't discriminate based on race, religion, or protected classes under the Constitution. But they can take down content if they think it's violent, even if it doesn't come close to violating a criminal law. So I do think they hide behind the First Amendment too much, but I think one way they get away from hiding behind that is if they can actually point to criminal laws that this might violate. It gives them this cover that they would like to have, and I don't mean to impugn them and suggest that they are people of bad faith, but it is true that the First Amendment doesn't apply to them, and so they have far more flexibility than the government does when it comes to regulating speech, and they've just been reluctant to use that. And to the extent that creating this criminal law that I actually think makes sense for many, many other reasons, gives them something to latch on to drive their policy, then great, then we should do it.
Excellent, thank you. Audrey, this is for you. So I was actually just reading in the newspaper, a legal journal yesterday about 230, and that the Supreme Court has denied to hear a recent case, but it will most likely be coming to the Supreme Court soon. And so this is a mix of my own question as well as from our audience, from Chris Kojum at GW. There's been calls to revise Section 230. What do you think of those calls? And do you think Section 230 needs revision? And if it was revised, what would that look like?
So a big question. And I'm not on the Supreme Court, and it shows just how far these questions are going to go up the chain. So I think it really shows where my position is in all of this, in terms of, I think it's something we really need to work through. And that's why even, one of my recommendations for the policy paper was to actually just take time to explore and discuss the role of intermediary liability, and specifically Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. So let me actually just backtrack, because I think for both the audience and this conversation, it actually helps to sort of set up exactly where this conversation is and sort of what are two sides of it. So I'm going to use some of my notes, just because I want to be rigorous in this, and I am not a lawyer. So I think that it is really important to emphasize, and for me to try and get these points as right as I can. So ultimately, I believe that government officials, legislators, and judges must help ensure that policies and laws evolve with the information environment through either judicial interpretation or legislation. So in the case of Section 230, for example, it's really essential part of the discussion about how to empower technology providers against terrorist exploitation of their platforms. So the statute offers protection for, in quotes, good Samaritan blocking and screening of offensive material, stating that no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. So in short, what this actually does is create measures that safeguard network providers by ensuring that, with a few exceptions, platforms cannot be sued for the content posted by a user, even if the company moderates some material. So again, that's sort of what we've laid out. So in doing so, lawmakers really intended to create a safe space for companies to enforce their platforms by leveraging incentives and protections rather than legal mandates. So when we look back to the creation of 230, the intentions were really, really good because it actually wanted to encourage companies to come up with their own ways to moderate content. So some say that this is a relatively pragmatic calculation, given the more stringent intermediary liability laws tend to invite risks to free expression, as well as hinder business and technological development. And today, some scholars argue that good intentions of CDA 230 in censoring offensive material are inconsistent with broad interpretations that serve to immunize the most ill-behaved platforms from liability. And I really recommend one of the most thought-provoking articles on this for me was The Internet Will Not Break by Keats and Trone and Ben Wittes, or Danielle Keats and Trone and Ben Wittes. But then we have to sort of look over at the other side. And let me just scroll down, because again, I want to be robust in reflecting all these different sides. The Center for Democracy and Technology put out a sort of guide for legislators who are engaging with 230 to help sort of raise awareness about how the statute works and why changing it would risk or would invite significant risk to free expression online. And ultimately, I think that we all need to get up to speed with this debate because it is very, very critical to the future of our internet. And we're sort of at a point where our policymakers need to still work to be more informed on these issues, which is why I raise questions about things like the Office of Technology Assessment and how we educate policymakers on this. But we the people, we the public, we the counterterrorism community, we the big we everywhere need to get up to speed with these questions because they have tremendous, tremendous implications for not only speech, but the future of the internet as we know it, pretty much. So I know that I was reading notes and that's not the best way to answer a prompt, but I think that having a robust discussion on this is critical.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Alex, I'm going to direct this towards you. We have a question from Marnie Adamson. Even in the event of a US regulatory movements on technology platforms, how would you manage extremists and or terrorist content on closed or fringe platforms that are not US hosted or US based? And I'd actually go a step further and ask, what does good governance look like of the internet?
The question gets at a very, at a much broader problem, which is the bifurcation of the internet into national internets that sort of are, technology that might be prevalent in one country but isn't prevalent in another for a variety of reasons. I would say that the US can set its laws in the territory it controls. And it can say that if these companies, the most successful of which want to do business here, then they have to follow and comply with US law. I would say for closed, so the example of say Signal being used, a closed encrypted chat app. Well, the government really shouldn't be in the business of looking through Signal, and I mean maybe part of the government is, but the government shouldn't be in the business of policing what's going on Signal. But they can enforce, rules that Signal or a company like it, has to follow if it seeks to do business in the territory, with our banks in our country. I'd say that there's a challenge here that terrorist use of the internet is an infinitesimal percentage of everything that happens on the internet a day. So we don't want to design it like terrorism, necessarily a terrorism-proof internet that forecloses other good things that the internet is for. But the misuse of the internet by terrorists also intersects with the misuse of the internet by other bad actors, people at home and people abroad. And I would say that this probably gets more at the, how to protect our elections against disinformation, how to secure, our technology to make sure that foreign actors can't hack and send targeted emails directed at voters, for example. That's a much bigger question, and it gets beyond terrorism. It gets beyond even disinformation into more of how, what is the point of this technology? Is it to serve the public, or is it the other way around?
Excellent. Thank you so much, Alex. Mary, this one's for you from Yevon Wan. From what I understand, it seems that a growing number of journalists, academics, and law enforcement officers are starting to realize that violent extremists increasingly do not subscribe to a single ideology, but a cocktail of different ideologies. So a violent individual may call oneself an incel, but also subscribe to white supremacist and anti-government beliefs. How might this observation inform possible legal reforms of domestic terrorism statutes? How do we categorize these individuals?
So that's a very accurate and astute observation with which I agree. And that is actually one reason why I think we should reform our terrorism laws to make sure that we are able to adequately address terrorism, no matter what the ideology is that motivates it. I don't see as a matter of public policy, not to mention law, why we should differentiate between ideologies when it comes to our criminal law. Now, we might say for our own personal reasons, certain ideologies we happen to think are worse than others, and that would be maybe based on personal preference. But when a person commits or attempts or conspires to commit a crime of violence to intimidate or coerce or influence the policy of government through intimidation or coercion, that's the conduct that we're penalizing. It's not the ideology behind it. So I think that sort of leveling the playing field and saying crimes of violence for intimidation or coercion are unlawful and are terrorist, regardless of ideology, helps to inform and educate and show society's condemnation for that technique. The way that we should, in this country, in a democratic republic, make decisions that are ideologically based is through our elected officials, through policies, through things like that, not through committing crimes of violence. And, I particularly say that as we go into the election, and there's a lot of talk by unlawful paramilitary organizations, potentially of arming themselves and deploying to the polls, again, probably in response to the president's call for his voters to watch the polls very carefully, his supporters, and telling the Proud Boys to stand by as opposed to denouncing them. There's a lot of groups out there who are talking about, well, maybe we need to deploy to protect the polls. Groups are talking about deploying post-election to protect against fraud in the ballot counting, a rigged election, and to try to prompt a civil war if they're not satisfied with the results of the election. That's not how we do it in a democracy, right? We choose our candidates based on ideas and policies and not based on intimidation and violence and armed unlawful activity. So I think that that applies whether it's right wing or left wing. Obviously, I do think when it comes to countering the extremism, then I think the ideology matters a lot, and it matters because it's going to take different approaches to try to, counter these types of ideologies, and depending on what motivates people. I will say, though, that even where the ideology is different, there sometimes is a common core, at least when groups try to solicit and try to motivate people to join in their extremist cause. And oftentimes that common core is to sort of appeal to people who are searching for something, right? They want to be part of something bigger. They want to have a mission that's bigger than their own life. Maybe they are experiencing, educational deficiencies, job deficiencies, just unhappiness, mental health issues. And what can be attractive to them is this idea of joining a cause bigger than themselves, whether it is, on behalf of ISIS or on behalf of a white supremacist group, or finding community with a group that does firearms and paramilitary training for a possible civil war. It's something bigger than themselves. And so it's important to realize that sometimes the ideology is not even that clear at the beginning in the person. It's that need for something greater. And there's one other point I want to make that's sort of tangentially related, because we have been talking about possibly a statute that would apply to all different ideologies. And one of the very valid concerns that people in the civil rights and civil liberties community talk about, and I consider myself one of those people these days, now that I've left the government and I do public interest litigation, is this fear that the government and the FBI in particular will misuse that of any authority that they have by virtue of a statute that would apply to domestic terrorism, and will target will target groups that really don't present the threat. So they'll target Black Lives Matter, or they'll target people whose views are more progressive for investigations, as opposed to targeting the people and groups who are advocating violence on behalf of the ideologies that are now recognized by our law enforcement as the most significant threat. So as I mentioned earlier, the director of the FBI has been clear: white supremacist violence presents the greatest threat. So the resources at the FBI to investigate potential violations of a terrorism statute that applies domestically to all ideology ought to be put toward where the threat is. And one way of checking on that is to require open public reporting by the FBI on a yearly basis of how many investigations have you opened, terrorism investigations, and what categories are they in? Now, I don't expect them to tell us the targets of their investigations. Even I wouldn't want them to do that. That's operationally stupid and won't result in any kind of good outcome. But they can do it by category, right? White supremacist motivated violence, animal rights violence, Islamist extremist violence, etc. And then we can see very publicly, are you putting your resources toward the actual threat that we know from empirical data? And that's where I think these ideologies can be very important. And that's where you're right, there could be some overlaps between them, and it might not be super easy to bucket them into categories, but I do think it's possible to make some pretty clear statements about the categories of ideology.
Excellent, thank you. Audrey, this is for you. This summer, we've seen a number of social media companies taking action against terrorist content online, including actions that are more nuanced than simple content removal. In 2018, you and Bill Braniff wrote a really great article about the need to engage with such actions. Can you speak a little bit more about this strategy and what has been done recently and what more can be done?
So I'll begin with the teaser and say, stay tuned, because we're scheming a follow-on piece to dig a little bit deeper in this. Bill has been a great partner working on this idea of the marginalization paradigm, and the idea that we should progressively work to sideline these threats because they aren't existential unless we make them existential and really allow them to become a real risk to our democracy and speech. So to simplify things and sort of speed through this, Facebook in particular has worked to develop what one might call like non-binary content moderation techniques. And when we get into non-binary content moderation techniques, the binary part is either it stays online or it goes offline. And pushing past that would constitute things like trying to limit the flow of information or anything that might fall under that bucket. So whether it is trying to do steps like making posts hard to find or not promoting certain content or recommending certain content, trying to sort of develop something that falls somewhere in between, because it says, look, this content isn't something we want to promote, but it's also not something that necessarily needs to be taken down. So, just as a quick take, Facebook rolled out sort of an announcement that it was going to work on leveraging some of these non-binary approaches against QAnon and militia movement. But ultimately, it pretty quickly backtracked. And I think that part of the challenge is traces back to one, we need to be more resilient because these things are going to take time and it's going to be imperfect and things are going to go wrong. And we need to understand that and be okay with that, because in the long term, if we can better tool these or better work these tools in the future and apply them against threats earlier, it may have a better effect on stymieing them. Because if we look at QAnon conspiracy, for example, trying to apply these tools right now in this environment, it's going to be hard and may not necessarily be the right move. But had we leveraged some of these tools earlier, to again, slow the proliferation of these movements, not necessarily completely shut them out and shut them down, but marginalize or keep fringe groups on the fringe, because these ideas have been promoted and mainstreamed because we allow them to do so. Again, they don't pose an existential problem for us unless we allow them to. So it's about sort of right-sizing the approach and keeping everything pragmatic and proportional.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Audrey. And that kind of ties into the Twitter decision in the last 24 hours, where we've seen if you want to retweet something, they're making sure you know what you're retweeting. And these are new tools that are kind of coming out at a very important time. And so maybe if we have implemented these earlier, there would be maybe less of a shock to them. But they're really interesting tools that we have in our kind of playbook. We're coming up on time, but I just kind of wanted to give each of our speakers 30 seconds to summarize the main points they want to get across to our audience. And Mary, we'll begin with you. Oh, still on mute, sorry.
I used up most of my 30 seconds unmuting myself. I think I've really had a great opportunity to make a lot of important points here. Again, I do think it's important to talk about terrorist use of the internet, but the thing I would really emphasize is, like, we don't have to label everybody a terrorist to hone in on the problems that we need to address when it comes to our use of social media. Because again, I would emphasize this path. Most people don't start out a terrorist plotting a terrorist attack. They start someplace else. And the resiliency points are great. Alex's analogies to other heavily regulated industries are just right on point. I mean, rarely do we just allow anything with such a huge impact on our life to go almost entirely unregulated. I don't even know what other industry would ever fit in that category. And it's difficult because other industries don't present that same confluence of First Amendment principles with what's being offered as a service, but those aren't insurmountable challenges. And so we don't need to just throw up our hands and say, we're going to do nothing. We have to have some careful thought toward it. And the folks involved in this forum today have given that some careful thought, and I appreciate that they continue to do so. Thank you.
Alex, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to Mary for those points, and Dev for moderating. It's been a fantastic panel. I would just close, to build on Mary's point, we don't need to have all of the answers in the next year, but a place where I would start would be around transparency. These organizations, these companies have a lot of power, and they're allowed, to sort of have a very high wall around how they conduct their business. And some of that's warranted because they're proprietary and they're businesses and they have rights. But when those rights interfere with the conduct of our democracy or with our public life or with our public safety, I think that there should be some requirement for some degree of transparency. As a customer, you have a right to know how and why a piece of content has reached you. If you subscribe to the New York Times and you see an ad, it's probably because you subscribe to the New York Times that ad reached you. We need a certain level of transparency that I think would provide a good foundation for a better informed public debate about mitigating terrorist use of the internet, as well as a range of other sort of social harms that come from social media.
Thank you. And finally, Audrey.
Yeah, tough crew to be an anchor for, but I guess I'll throw on my instructor hat for the last 30 seconds and say it's just been such an interesting time to be working and teaching, as I'm also learning in this cycle to try and engage students on these issues, but also engage my peers and colleagues, both around here and all around the world. So I think that one thing that I'd really just like to punctuate is that we're going to get to the solution by working together, not by, again, falling apart. And I think that in this world, it's really easy to shut each other down and say that's not the route to success. And I think that ultimately we need to really reflect on what it means to come together and collaborate and engage with partners, because that's how we're going to get to a better space with this. But that takes effort and willingness to collaborate. So I hope that everybody is, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. I wish I could listen to all of you even more. So please feel free to continue to engage and reach out. And thanks so much.
And thank you to our audience for listening with us today. And thank you to Audrey Alexander, Alexander Guittard, and Mary McCord for joining us. If you'd like to learn more about positions that have been discussed, please check out our policy papers on the Program on Extremism website. I saw a question there. We have all of the policy papers written by our speakers and panelists here today. And I highly recommend you join in and think about Section 230 as we move forward. Everyone have a great day.